Welcome to the January 22nd, 2025 episode of the Energy Show. I'm energy journalist Markham Hislop. Now, look, we normally air at 12:15 p.m. Mountain Time, but we're moving to 5:15 or 5-ish, I guess, p.m. Pacific Time, 6 o'clock Mountain Time, for a reason. President Donald Trump has issued an emergency energy executive order that we want to talk about. And our expert, Dr. Kristen Biezenbos from California Western School of Law, was only available now. So welcome to the interview, Kristen.
Thank you very much. And I do have to say, I'm not actually a doctor. I feel like my friends with PhDs, if they saw that, would be just a
I,
purpose.
I understand how it is. We'll call you professor from now on.
Okay.
So this, I don't know what to make of this because I read the executive order, and to me, it looks alarming. It looks like the president is giving in fact, what he does is it looks like he transfers or gives the Army and the Army Corps of Engineers, which is not exactly the Corps of Engineers, not exactly an Army institution. I get that, but it looks like what he does is he's bringing a lot of the agencies under his uh, jurisdiction or power, more so, in order to make changes in the oil and gas system and in the power system. And he says that there's a huge national crisis. And I'll just read. Here's the preamble, and you can tell me what you think. So, purpose. The energy and critical minerals identification, leasing, development, production, transportation, refining, and generation capacity of the United States are all far too inadequate to meet our nation's needs. We need a reliable, diversified, and affordable supply of energy to drive our nation's manufacturing, transportation, and so on, caused by the harmful and short-sighted policies of the previous administration. Well, no big surprise that he would take a shot at the outgoing Biden administration. But he talks about how the nation's inadequate energy supply and infrastructure causes and makes worse the high energy prices that devastate Americans, particularly those living on low and fixed incomes. Frankly, I went and looked at the data. I went to the U.S. Energy Information Administration pages and I looked at things like retail price of gasoline. The average is $3.10 across the United States. I mean, that's historically a moderate price, at least in the 2020s. I looked at electricity prices now in San Diego, where you're based, they're quite high. I understand that,
Yes.
30, 40, 50 cents a kilowatt hour is quite high. But the average across the country was in the 12 to 15 cent range per kilowatt hour. Gas prices are down around $2 or under. It just seems like, like, where's the beef? And is this, you've probably seen other executive orders that have been created by presidents. Is this unusual, to set up this, what I would call a false emergency to justify this?
It's unusual to use the emergency powers in this way, for sure. Declaring that there's a national emergency in terms of inadequate energy supply and that is endangering the US electricity system, tech companies, American consumers. There isn't really any data to back that up, as you said. I think that well, there's a few things going on. One, I mean, in some ways, it's not as bad as it looks, but in other ways, it's just as bad as it looks, possibly worse. So the not as bad as it looks part is that the Army Corps of Engineers, the EPA, the Department of the Interior, the Department of Energy, all of those executive agencies are already technically under the president's authority. They're part of the executive branch, and the president is the head of the executive. So that's why he's able to issue executive orders. When he does that, he is sending directions to the agencies, some of them, all of them. In this case, basically every agency he could think of that has something to do with carrying out environmental protection regulations. So that includes the EPA, the Department of Energy, FERC, and the Army Corps of Engineers. There's also Fish and Wildlife, Bureau of Land Management. There's quite a lot of agencies that have some role to play in environmental protections. And so I think what he's doing is he's using the executive order plus sort of supercharging it by saying it's an emergency. So he has special powers. The president has special powers when he declares an emergency. And that does allow him to fast track a slew of different initiatives to multiple agencies all at the same time, which is not normally something that you can do. So I think of his use of the Emergencies Act is a way to sort of have it all, just sort of bulk buy all of the environmental regulations and initiatives that were passed by the Biden administration. However, the sort of silver lining, if you want to call it that, is that he actually, a lot of the things he is trying to do with this executive order, he can't necessarily do. And as to your where's the beef comment, I would agree that there is no affordability crisis with oil and gas in the United States. The US is producing more oil and gas than it ever has. And so that's not really an issue. But I do think what's happening is that he's listening to people in the tech industry that are concerned about not enough electricity generation for their data centers, for their AI projects. Those data centers need a tremendous amount of electricity, and they need it to be a steady source, a 24/7 source of electricity, because data centers run all the time. So what they want is a steady source of electricity. And that's, I think, where the emphasis on fossil fuels comes in.
See, I get the power sector. I sit on the media panel for the U.S. Energy Association, and once a month, I'm not there every month, but usually there are power sector executives who are on the experts panel. We get to ask them questions, do interviews with them during the briefing. And there'll be 5 executives on at a time, and we've done this a number of times over the last couple of years. My point here is that I've had a chance to listen to the concerns expressed by the people who are running the system operators, the utilities, and so on. And they're having big problems because demand is increasing. The latest one I saw was 3.5% per year going forward. That's incredible growth. The American grid is already old and creaky. It's not, they're just modernizing it. They can't get equipment. So if they want a transformer, for example, it's years out from the time you put in the order when you'll actually get one. There are all sorts of regulatory and what they call red tape. So, permitting, getting generators like wind and solar farms connected to the grid. There are problems with many of the utilities are retiring thermal generation, the coal and the gas, quicker than they can be replaced with wind and solar or some other kind of. I mean, it's a mess down there. And they're very concerned about that. I get it. But that still is not an emergency in this constitutional sense that the president is using it here in this his executive order, correct?
No, I'd agree with that. It's not an emergency. Like I said, he's just using the Emergencies Act because it allows him to target multiple agencies, multiple sets of regulations, and give them multiple sets of marching orders all at the same time. This is not something he would normally be able to do. And the emergency powers do allow him to do certain things immediately and to put indefinite holds on other things immediately.
Now, I talked to a couple of lawyers this afternoon to get a handle on this, and one of them is a former colleague of yours at the University of Calgary, but it is not his area of expertise, so I won't say his name to protect the guilty, right?
Okay.
But whereas I think the conversation that you and I are having is the best case scenario. It's the president trying to do away with. He wants to make change. He wants to get rid of the Biden era rules and regulations and that are an impediment to industry. Okay, great. And this makes it easier for him to do it. So he's not as frustrated. We know Trump isn't exactly a technocrat. But this other lawyer said, you know what? In this document, the use emergency powers is used an alarming number of times. And the type of power that it discusses is not what you would normally see in, a restrained approach to this. And there are provisions in here for directing agency, the Army or the Army Corps of Engineers to direct various departments to send reports. And it looks like this is not meant to be the kind of thing like when Prime Minister Justin Trudeau ordered in the use the Emergency Powers Act, Measures Act in Canada for 2 weeks, clear protesters out of Ottawa, done. This is not that. And so he actually, this unnamed lawyer, who's your former colleague, said there are parallels here in the language to other authoritarian regimes like Pinochet in Chile back in the 60s and 70s. So he took the more extreme view, and I'm just wondering how you would respond to that.
Well, I would say that it's certainly trying to do what Trump is doing by sort of unilaterally calling something an emergency without the need or any attempt really to prove it or to explain why, to offer any data or any information really that backs up the idea that there's an emergency. So the fact that he's doing it, he's trying to work within available power that he has to force through the kinds of policies that he wants. It's certainly very concerning because there is no emergency. So this is really just about him trying to fast track his own policy priorities. I see this actually as a wholesale attack on the renewable energy sector from multiple different angles. And so I think that's what it's really about. I don't think that it's really about trying to get oil companies to drill in Alaska. I don't know that they're even interested in doing that because as we've talked about, the level of drilling that's going on right now in the US is extremely high. And if they drill more, they're only going to cause the prices of oil to go down, which is not profitable for companies. They are also highly automated. So I don't know. I mean, you're not going to get any more people, any jobs than there already are, considering the levels of drilling are already at record highs. However, when you start to compare him to things like Pinochet, this is where I feel like he might want to be that way. He may have these authoritarian and these sort of like fascist kind of, I don't want anything to stand in my way. I don't know why I have to do things this way. I don't understand why things are standing between me and the goals that I want to achieve. But the fact is, there are things standing between him and the goals he wants to achieve. So the real question, I think, can't be answered yet. The question to me is the American legal system, including administrative law, able to stop him? Because it should be able to. It requires, even in an emergency, there's some things that can't just be swept aside. There's procedure that has to be followed. And what I'm curious to see and what would really make me concerned, and we haven't seen it yet, is to what extent his administration will actually be able to either erode or entirely ignore procedural requirements, because that's what it would take to do some of the things he's trying to do here. It's not legal, but he's got a lot of judges on certain courts who might back him up, even without a real sort of legal foundation for that. And that, I think, is what is really frightening. But we haven't seen that yet.
Well, let's talk about that because his cabinet this time has a very different construction than the one it did last time. I mean, he had some people in it last time who raised eyebrows, but this one, I mean, Fox News hosts, I mean, and that's not even the most egregious one, the most egregious appointments. So the one construction one could put on this is that he's brought in people who will do what he wants. They'll take orders and they really don't care. They're not bound by the kind of training, the kind of tradition, the kind of respect for democratic norms, the on and on and on that, people in those positions normally are. And so that then gives him an opportunity to kind of run roughshod over the rules, ignore some of these things that other more considered appointees might do. And then there's the issue of what can he change, given the fact that the Republicans do have slim majorities in Congress. Because the guardrails that are up now may not be how the guardrails look a year from now or 2 years from now.
I mean, that is kind of the question. I will say again, to sort of pull us back from the brink a little bit, he can put into the leadership positions of the agencies. Many agencies are run by committees or boards of people who are appointed by whoever is the sitting president. So that's what we're seeing right now is he is appointing people to be chairs of agencies, heads of agencies, board members of agencies. But the fact is, the agencies are not just their leadership. That's why he's also trying to attack the federal workforce, the people who work for the agencies, because they bring with them decades of experience. They know how things are supposed to go. And even when people at the top tell them to ignore those things, they won't necessarily ignore those things. That's something that he ran into during his first term. And it's one of the reasons why he spent so much time making attacks against federal workers. But I would say that even if he appoints people who will do his bidding and ignore the rules, ignore the law, which is what it would take, it's not just the rules, it's the law. It's internal procedures and regulations in the agencies, and then also freestanding legislation like the Administrative Procedure Act. It requires things to be done a certain way. If they're not done that way, they are illegal. So at that point, the question is the judiciary going to be able to stand up and say, you cannot do it this way? He's tried already. He tried to push things through with executive orders that couldn't be done that way. And courts said no. So I think that's what we have to see. We have multiple levels of checks and balances in the US. The concern is that all of them will fail to check his power. That is when you can start talking about Pinochet. Because
Well, and
it's not just about a man who wants to have no rules, who wants to be able to just unilaterally do things at his own order. You can have a man who wants to do that. The question is the rest of the government, including the legal system, going to let him?
how eroded are the legal system, the federal civil service, a lot of these checks and balances that were in place in 2016 when he won his first election, I guess from 2017 on when he was president. There was a lot of talk then about eroding some of these. He had a fixation with the Department of Justice. He didn't appoint many to replace. He fired secretaries, assistant undersecretaries, didn't replace them, basically left it a kind of a shell of what it had been. He's talking now about weaponizing the Department of Justice. I mean, that's fairly strong language, not to be ignored. So can he, did he already start the process of eroding that authority back in his first term? Can he do it more systematically and to a greater extent in this term so that some of the things we've talked about here might be possible that were previously impossible?
He could. I mean, certainly he appointed a great deal of judges, federal judges to the bench. We now have like entire circuit courts like the Fifth Circuit that are comprised almost entirely of Trump appointees, and they have shown that they are deciding cases in a way that isn't consistent with principles of stare decisis. So they're not afraid to just say what they feel the holding should be, regardless of what past cases would have dictated the outcome would be. And so I think there are concerns. I think that he understands better now what he would need to do, who he needs to remove, the kinds of people he needs to get out of his way. But again, there are still constitutional checks and balances in place. So it really is going to take a complete failure by right now a Republican-controlled Congress to defend the country, because the entire country is undermined when the constitutional framework is ignored, when legislation that was correctly passed is trampled, all in the name of accomplishing something, trying to fast track something, ignore all of the rules, calling it an emergency, whatever he wants to try to do to make it happen. There are safeguards in place to prevent a runaway Congress, a runaway president, a runaway judiciary. But if they all are runaway, then we're not in a good position.
Well, let's go back to oil and gas for a moment, because I mean, you worked in Calgary and you're an energy law professor. I mean, this is your area of expertise. And yesterday on the show, we're looking at the way why would Trump put 25% a tariff on Canadian oil imports? There's about 4 million barrels a day, 3.2, 3.3 million barrels a day of heavy crude that Midwestern and Gulf Coast refineries are set up. They have special kit that they've invested in. So if they can't get that oil, that's an investment that sits there idle. And if they have to then buy, excuse me, more expensive light sweet crude, whether they get it from the shale or it's imported from someplace or whatever. So the question was, why would he do that? And I advanced a little hypothesis, and I want to get your view on this, and a couple of reasons. One is the shale break-even costs are rising per barrel. So they range between, like in the Permian and the Eagle Ford, they range between $56 and $66 per barrel. Well, we're getting, the EIA is forecasting $70 a barrel as the average price for 2025. Those margins are getting squeezed.
Yeah.
pretty hard. So you can see where he would say, well, we're going to get rid of all of the Biden era regulations and the red tape and the things that increase costs for producers. And we're going to let them into low cost federal lands to drill, and that'll lower their costs, and then their margins are better and better for the industry. Okay, that's one thing. We'll see if that plays out. I think that's a reasonable take on it. But the other question is then, what the hell is he doing with Canada? It just makes no sense, except that he's got this doctrine of energy dominance. And if I was looking around to say, okay, we're going to increase production in the United States, maybe putting more oil out into the international markets is not the greatest idea. The Saudi Arabia might be a little annoyed at that, and they break even as $25. So let's not. But you know what? We could beat up on those Canadians, and we could take market share away from them. Those refineries that are now processing cheap, heavy Canadian crude, they can refine light, sweet crude from the shale basins. And maybe he thinks, well, instead of 4 million barrels a day, maybe we'll only import two. And then we'll open up that market share to the American producers. Now, I know that's a little out there, and there's not a lot of evidence for it, but it's a hypothesis. So I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, at this point, because there isn't a clear economic case for doing this, and it certainly doesn't make sense from the point of view of maintaining positive relationships with our closest allies, I think every guess as to why he's doing this at this point is basically a hypothesis. My feeling about it is twofold. One, I think he's looking for a quick source of cash because his plans to cut taxes, especially for the extremely wealthy, are going to leave us in a more serious deficit than we're already in. So he needs money and he needs it fast. So squeezing from other countries that don't really have an alternative but to trade with us, I think is one way to do it. And the fact that it causes our relationship to sour, this is sort of the other part of it. I don't think he cares because I don't think, and this is just my opinion, but I get the feeling that Trump admires people who rule through fear and domination, like Putin, for example. I mean, right now he's being very tough with Putin about Ukraine, but I don't think he likes the idea of being a statesman, give and take, compromise, cooperation. I don't think he likes that. I think he feels like the US is the biggest economy in the world, and it's time to remind people that you need us. And so it's time to show you that we're in charge. And the fact that this is going to blow up a lot of our relationships, the fact that the Canada's our largest trading partner. And I think the biggest thing that he doesn't seem to realize or maybe doesn't care about is that this is going to hurt Americans just as much, if not more, as it will hurt Canadians. He does not seem to care. So,
Yeah, I see your point. I think that's exactly some of his motivation. The idea that he has to generate cash, tax revenue, that is not a small matter. I mean, one of the issues in Alberta is what happens when the global oil industry gets disrupted. We hit peak oil demand begins to fall, prices fall, and suddenly the Alberta government can't take in $20 billion of oil revenue every year
right.
and pay for its education and healthcare. And he's kind of in the same spot. I mean, if he
Yeah.
wants to cut taxes, the debt is already an issue. He's got plenty of people in Congress who don't like debt in principle, and certainly aren't happy about the growing level of debt. And he piled on lots of debt in his first term. And so why not just go out and bully take
Yeah.
take the other kids'
Yeah.
lunches, and their lunch money, and pay for his tax cuts with that.
Yeah. I mean, people in Canada can't vote. I mean, but again, the question is, because this has the potential to cripple certain American industries, because I don't think that like it's fully been absorbed by people that who is it that pays this tariff again? Like, I don't think it's fully, the US is dependent on many of our trade relationships. If we were suddenly not able to import certain goods from places like Mexico, Canada, even China, we have not somehow magically created a way to generate those things domestically. And so we are putting American industry in the position where they're going to be forced to pay these tariffs, right? So I don't really understand this. There's a reason why generally tariffs are only used punitively or carefully in specific industries. I don't know any economist who thinks this is a good idea, but I think it is kind of a cash grab. And maybe he thinks he can bully so successfully that Canada and Mexico will capitulate to trade terms that are heavily favorable towards the US. And then it's just a big success story. And yes, it costs some of our industries a lot of money, but now it's all good.
Yeah, well, you know what? The Smoot-Hawley tariffs in during the Depression are just evidence that you don't necessarily have to believe economics or evidence. That ideology or whatever it is that's driving you can.
Yeah, and there's also this like terrible sort of logic to it too, where if you make enough money off of these tariffs, so basically sucking money away from Canadian and Mexican companies, that's the sort of the biggest two examples. There may even be a way to siphon some of that revenue into tax subsidies and other support programs for the industries that are hit hardest by tariffs. So in a weird way, you're like robbing Peter to pay Paul. We'll see. I mean, that's my guess about why he's doing it, but who knows?
Let's wrap up the interview with get your thoughts on the his rearranging of relations with the allies because energy plays such a big role in this
Yeah.
and a lot of what we talked about plays into it. I mean, I mention this all the time in my podcast. Gina Raimondo, the Biden Secretary of Commerce, gave a speech in 2022, and she said, in 2020, we woke up to the fact that we were dependent on Chinese supply chains. And this is our emerging geopolitical rival. And we cannot be in a position where we might be in a hot war with China. Who knows? China invades Taiwan and we have to go to war with them. Who knows? You can't be reliant on many of your goods, and especially key technologies. You can't rely on your enemy for
Right.
those. And so
Right.
they said, look, we have to do a couple of things. We have to revitalize manufacturing, and we have to, build solar panels and wind turbines and electric vehicles and batteries. Okay. But we also have to bring our allies in with us. We
Mhm.
need, so the Inflation Reduction Act money, of which there was a great deal, it was made in America, but also if you're you have a free trade agreement with us, which was great for Mexico and Canada.
Sure.
So now
Yeah.
you had a North American bloc and that sort of offset China and Russia, and of course you have European allies, and there was a rearranging of geopolitical,
Mhm.
alliances there around these technologies and around the rise of China. And Trump, in one fell swoop, has just lit the fuse to the dynamite underneath the building.
Yes.
He's Guy Fawkes.
Yeah.
And what's the thinking then amongst, folks that down there? What's the thinking? But does he get it? Like, does he understand this?
No, I don't think so. I think what he understands is the people who have his ear, who are mostly, big power companies, utilities that are frustrated being forced to divest themselves of profitable fossil fuel plants. If you rely on wind and solar power, for example, you have to make expensive upgrade to your systems, which is not something the utilities want to do because they don't get revenue for that. So they'd rather depend on gas power plants, for example. That's another way that they can also supply steady power, cheap steady power to data centers, for example. So I think what he's hearing is the immediate concerns and sort of aggravations of certain industries, and he's not hearing much about what you're thinking. But the nascent industries, solar power batteries, I mean, solar, wind power, batteries like this, even though these businesses in the US are mature, they're not a mature industry in the same way that fossil fuels or electric utilities are. These companies have been around for over 100 years. They have sophisticated lobbying efforts. They are very close to Trump. They've had his ear since his first administration. I think it's just a question of who's in the room with him. Also, Trump doesn't believe in climate change, so I feel like he doesn't really understand why we should even have any of these things. So why should we get into it? We don't need to worry about supply chains with China because wind and solar are stupid. We don't really need that. Climate change isn't real. And so let everybody else, go after those technologies, and the US will just shut the door on them altogether.
Yeah, that's an interesting argument because we've been arguing at Energy Media now for a number of years that stop thinking about this in terms of climate change. I know it's a climate crisis. We know we're watching LA burn for crying out loud. We get.
Yes.
But if you want to talk to people like Trump and other industry leaders and people in these energy industries, you need to frame it in terms of technological change and market change. So these clean energy technologies have been around for decades. They've been getting better and better and better and cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. Now China has adopted them. They're scaling them up. They're bringing the costs down. It's a competitive advantage for China.
Yes.
And the US, whether it believes in climate change or not, whether it gives a fig about emissions, this is a competitive issue. It's a military preparedness issue. It's a national security issue. These are the things that Raimondo and Jake Sullivan and Drew Brees and others in that administration, that's the way they think. And I think that was a reflection of how like the Europeans think and others think. My goodness. So what we're doing is basically taking a step back. The United States is taking a step back.
Yes, I would say that is correct. I think that Trump is in rooms with people who it's entirely possible that companies like Meta and Google, their environmental commitments were because that's what the sort of prevailing kind of morality was for consumers. But, the people of the US elected Trump. And so they did that knowing that he doesn't believe in climate change, that he intended to open up public lands for more oil and gas, that he's hostile towards renewables, that he doesn't actually care about emerging technologies because the people who have his ear are in those established industries that are threatened by those competitive technologies that are on the rise. So, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if people like Mark Zuckerberg, who previously were completely committed to having their data centers 100% renewable, are now totally fine with running their data centers off of gas. It's cheap. It's 24/7 electricity. And, people voted for Trump, so they don't care that much. So,
Well, Kristen, thank you very much. And I think that
sure.
the last part of our conversation illustrates a point that we make here, which is that China was the first, it wasn't the first mover because that would be Germany and others, but nevertheless, they are the mover now. And America risks lose it's now running third behind Europe in a lot of the clean energy metrics, and it'll be running a lot further behind, and it'll be much harder to catch up should this we not get another Trump style government after Trump.
Yeah.
So well, this has been fascinating. I really appreciate this. Thank you very much for doing this.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.